Hello, and welcome everybody on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Tasha Kheiriddin, and I'm a principal with Navigator Limited and the national political columnist for Post Media. And it is a great pleasure, as I said, to be hosting today's webinar, which is Pandemic Resilience and Access to New Drugs in the COVID-19 Era, a subject that preoccupies everyone on this call and everyone in general. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, as we know, is continuing to upend our lives, and access to new and timely innovative medicines, vaccines, means of treating this disease are foremost in everybody's thoughts. So we have two panels today who will be discussing all the issues around this subject, ranging from drug pricing and challenges to innovation in our first panel, and secondly, lessons learned about global resilience and vaccine supplies, achieving them, resilience learned from experiences around the world. We're going to start off with our first panel around drug pricing, a very topical issue as more and more drugs and vaccine innovations come onto the market. How will Canada afford these? Are we able to develop them on our own? What have we learned from the COVID-19 experience here in this country? We have a terrific panel of three experts who will be discussing these issues with us today, starting with John Adams, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Canadian PKU and Allied Disorders. He's also the board chair of the Best Medicines Coalition. Welcome, John. You see him there. Richard Owens is a Munk Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's also a lawyer and the past chair of the board of directors of the University of Toronto Innovations Foundation. Nigel Rawson rounds out our trio for the first panel. He is a pharmacoepidemiologist, I got it right, and pharmaceutical policy researcher. He's based in Saskatoon and has performed studies on the use of drugs and their outcomes for the past 40 years. So welcome to all three of you. And we're going to start off the conversation today with some initial observations that you have in terms of the challenges that we face in Canada around drug pricing and innovation. So John, what do you feel? What are, I guess, the biggest takeaways that you have from the last almost 2 years of experience in the COVID-19 era on these questions in Canada? And you're on mute, John. The least favorite words of anyone in this era. The Zoom era too, so go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to start by framing this with a forecast into the future. Not just the drugs we have available today, but what drugs are we likely to have available in the future. And a global organization called IQVIA, which tracks pharmaceutical sales around the world, has given a forecast last week of 300 new drugs coming, being invented and brought to market in the next 5 years. That's 60 drugs a year or 5 drugs a month. That's a substantial increase in the pace of global innovation. That is not tracked by the actual pace of innovation in Canada, unfortunately. I have a son with a rare genetic condition that was treated with initially from the 1950s by a severe diet restriction. He volunteered for a clinical trial for the first pharmaceutical, and it works for him very, very well. And he had to go to a clinical trial. Early access to new therapies is by way of clinical trials for promising new therapies. We don't have enough emphasis on cutting the red tape and reducing the costs of drug developers bringing clinical trials to Canada. That's one of our problems. In the case of my son's drug, it was approved by the FDA in 2007. It was approved by the European Medicines Agency in 2010. In 2008, and was approved by Health Canada in 2010. That's 11 years ago, and still today, most provinces, through their drug programs, are not covering that drug. His condition is known as PKU, phenylketonuria. It's not it's not life-threatening, but it is brain-threatening. So my son is a high-functioning person because of innovation. He had to go to, it was developed by an American company. He had to go to America for a clinical trial. And he was the first patient in Canada to get the drug through a special access program. That's just one personal example. I also happen to be a widower. My wife died 7 years ago of ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and we're on the cusp of many breakthroughs. I hope quite a few of those 300 drugs that's heading our way in the next 5 years will help the people with the lethal and horrible disease of ALS. But let's put it this way, as looking back on lessons from this pandemic, the Canadian experience can be described as what farmers would understand. We're locking the door of the barn after the animals have gotten out. And here we go again in the latest round with Omicron, as far as I'm concerned. So what we need to do is, there are too many levels, too many layers, too many steps in the process, as it is from the regulatory approval for the safety and the efficacy and the quality manufacturing of a new therapeutic, and then a whole other process called health technology assessment, and then a whole other process around price negotiations before the drug can actually become available so that doctors can prescribe it and patients can actually get the benefits of it. And we need to crank up the system, and we need to simplify the system. The other thing, the pandemic has spoiled us a little bit because we got to actually watch experts debate in open session at the advisory committees of the US FDA and the US Centers for Disease Control. The merits, the ins and outs of things. For those of us who cared about these things, you could follow it. You actually could see the conversation. And there's in the American processes, there's actually opportunities for public comment. Those led to recommendations. Government officials still had the responsibility for making decisions of which vaccines to approve under what conditions, and which drug therapeutics to approve and under what conditions. We don't have that. I look forward to the day when the National Advisory Committee on Immunization in Canada actually has an open meeting, and we can all watch it on YouTube and see what we think of what the various experts and the various perspectives are they really getting it? And the debate here in Canada about upgrading our masks is just one example where there needs to be more openness and more transparency. So that's how I would kick it off.
That's an excellent way to kick it off. And certainly transparency and discussion is critical to getting all the issues on the table, which is why we really are so excited about this conversation today as well. Richard Owens, you're up next. Maybe a legal perspective, what you've learned in the last, like I said, almost 2 years during this pandemic, what Canada has learned going forward about innovation and new medicines.
Thank you so much, Tasha. I'm almost inclined to give my time over to saying, like John said, the legal perspective and the systems perspective, these are critical, because that's the way that governments work. They don't affect. They can't come to the bedside. They can't solve the problems of the patient directly. But the personal aspect is what we have to keep in mind, and that's something that John articulated so well. And his calls for transparency and promptness couldn't be more on point. We just are going through this pandemic with a response that has been slow, driven by a lugubrious public sector that is insulated from the impacts of the pandemic while inflicting them on the rest of us. We're not in it together by any stretch. And that, unfortunately, that static, that control-oriented approach that can't evolve is typical of the way we approach innovation in this country as well, and of the way we approach managing pharmaceutical supply. So we have a system that is woefully unable to promote and bring to commercialization the actually quite effective research efforts that we have in Canada, that greatly hinders the registration and importation of new drugs in Canada, and that ensures that we don't fund or promote the development of yet undiscovered pharmaceuticals. And that costs, of course, are enormous in terms of our health, in terms of costs to our healthcare system, and in terms of lost years of productivity. The multiplying effects of pharmaceutical innovations on the economy and on our well-being are staggering. For every dollar spent in pharmaceutical commercialization, we reap $7 in benefits, it is said. But yet, we have a country where innovation is a political byword, but we don't do it. We are actively hostile to innovation. We couldn't be on worse terms with the pharma industry. We will not advance our intellectual property laws to protect pharmaceuticals or other creators. We're stuck in like a 1950s mindset of price control and lassitude, when we could be part of, we've got the ingredients, we could be part of a tremendous national and international dynamic life sciences environment. One of the greater inhibitors is the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, which is coming out with new regulations because it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. The new regulations have proven to be a grave error for it. They are trying to reach into areas of bulk price negotiations, which in part being what have sidelined the PMPRB, and pharmacoeconomics, a way of drug price controls, which is not appropriate to it. And these new regulations are going to make the situation far worse, and they are attracting a great chorus of criticism of the PMPRB, as well as two constitutional challenges, which will be successful. They're going to prove that the PMPRB and the new regulations are unconstitutional, and the whole sandcastle is going to tumble down. The recent Alexian pharmaceutical case, for instance, demonstrates that the PMPRB has nothing to do with patent abuse, which is its sort of flimsy constitutionality cover story. It's just price control. So, in the end, we're a country with great promise, a country with great wealth, and a country that is determined to defeat itself. We free ride shamelessly and to an unbelievable extent on the American consumer to subsidize our drug access. We've got to stop. It's time we became a virtuous player in the international drug creation and research arena. And by doing so, we will be vastly better prepared for the next pandemic, because we will have the international connections that we need to respond, because we'll never be able to do it all ourselves. It's too complex. It's too big. Just as the viruses don't know borders, so too innovation does not. It's time to stop being as self-defeating as we are and grow up. Thanks, Tasha.
All right, very strong words, Richard. Thank you. You said next pandemic, which makes me shiver, but it is true. It is something that could happen again and continues to affect us now. Last for our opening remarks here is Nigel Rawson. And Nigel, I know you've written about the last PMPRB decision in the Financial Post, so I know you have strong views on that as well. But what would you say are Canada's biggest lessons or takeaways from the COVID-19 experience when it comes to innovation and drug pricing?
I think that we, as Richard said, we don't value innovation particularly. We do a lot of work in universities that lead to promising developments, but we don't really then take it beyond that to the commercialization process. So it's we undervalue and have done. We have, as Richard said, we've undervalued innovation for many, many years. In particular, there's been an antagonistic approach to the pharmaceutical industry from the federal and to a certain extent from the provincial territorial governments. It's sort of an ambivalence there. Certain provinces where most of the facilities are based recognize their benefits for not only to health but also to their economies. But it's a sort of antagonistic approach. So we don't really value what they do. On the other hand, Canada seems to think of itself as a premier country in terms of its appeal for the pharmaceutical industry to bring new medicines here. That's not true. At best, we're at the second line, probably third line, and certainly if we introduce those the PMPRB regulations that Richard was mentioning, we'll be way down the list. There's just no incentive to bring a new drug here the incentive at the moment is quite limited based on the fact that we've got all these hurdles that John mentioned. In addition, he didn't mention the fact that having gone through all those hurdles, that you still then have to get each province and territory on board to agree to fund those medicines. And they may well fund them, but they don't fund them very well, or they fund them to only a restricted group, or there's lots and lots of conditions. So currently there's lots of hurdles, and with the PMPRB we'll just simply add another hurdle, probably an even bigger one, that will shift us down, and we'll gradually become a sort of irrelevant market. We don't have a huge population. When you consider our neighbor, the United States, many Western European countries have much, much bigger populations. So that presents a bigger market. If then the conditions are much easier to get your drug to the patients, then why would you consider Canada, as high on the list?
All right, and more strong words. We're now going to proceed to some questions for our panel, and I encourage you who are watching to enter some questions as well in the chat function. And if your questions are entered there, then I can add them to our list of questions that we have a lot for our panelists today. I want to circle back to you, John, on the question not of drugs being introduced here, but Canada manufacturing some on its own. We saw at the beginning of this pandemic the failed partnership, the CanSino partnership that was proposed. So the idea of partnering with others if we cannot completely do it on our own. But then there's also the Medicago vaccine, which was developed, but is not on the list of the sort of acceptable vaccines. It's great frustration for people who've received it in terms of travel and other things. I'm wondering what Canada's learned about or could do better in terms of manufacturing domestically. And you're on mute again.
My bad.
That's 2 strikes. You're going to be out soon.
Okay. I'm not sure we have learned the lessons. We certainly haven't applied the lessons. Right now, there's a big push for booster shots and to get the children vaccinated with their first shots. And how many of those shots are being manufactured in Canada? 0. All right. There are a few people with a made in Canada product through very few clinical trials, Medicago being one example, but it's not yet authorized. So we're still 2 years into the pandemic. We're still wholly dependent upon the global village to come to our rescue with the vaccines and also with the therapeutic drugs. None of the therapeutic drugs present or coming have been manufactured in Canada. There is one of the technologies for the mRNA delivery mechanism was developed by some scientists and a company in Vancouver, and has been licensed by one of the major providers. But with that stands out as the exception to the norm. Our recently resigned Canadian ambassador to China, before he took that role on, Dominic Barton, headed a committee that laid out a map for a brave new world of life science strategy in Canada. It has been largely ignored. So that's why I'm actually going to leap ahead and say, we need a robust public inquiry, the vigorous, so to get the answer and to come up with solutions. What were the actual barriers? And the stumbling blocks are attitudinal, and they're attitudinal in Ottawa primarily, that this is not an important thing, that encouraging, actually contributing to global innovation is not a big agenda item for the powers that be in the provinces, and in particular in the federal government in Ottawa. So we're not doing well. It would be my summary comment.
Okay, short of an inquiry, which we can discuss a bit in greater detail, whether that is something that would be helpful. How does one get that attention, or how does one impart that to the consciousness of our policymakers in terms of the need for greater innovation in this country? Does anyone have any thoughts on that aspect? Because you'd think the last 2 years would have really hammered that home. Richard?
Thanks. I think if there was a way, we'd have figured it out by now. It's very hard to overstate the deafness and hostility of the Canadian government to innovation. And part of it is they don't get what innovation is. They don't get the dynamic free market systems that drive it. They don't like the fact that it is an uncontrolled and uncontrollable and unpredictable phenomenon. They like the idea of handing out subsidies that create political favoritism and labeling them innovation. But they only do harm. They do not actually drive innovation. They do the opposite. What we need to do is to develop a different mindset that actually helps create pools of available capital in this country, that strengthens intellectual property regimes. If you talk to the drug makers, they look for predictability, and they look for at least hospitality, if not favor. And they look ahead. And they look at Canada, and they see a long history of hostility and failure to adopt policies that would support their businesses. That can change quickly. Look at Israel. Israel was in the doldrums with drug development. They made some strong policy changes, improved their intellectual property laws. They're now in the top few countries. We could do that. We've got all the ingredients, but there's no sign of leadership in government. And I would say academically across the country, we are back in the 50s. There is a hostility to intellectual property. There is hostility to innovation. I don't see us getting there. I really don't.
All right. Well, we hope that we can get there. I do think, though, you said that there are more changes coming, and we've touched on this. So I think I'm going to lead to that piece, and we can maybe explore it in more detail. The Patented Medicine Price Review Board, or PMPRB for short, changes that have been proposed that have been bouncing back and forth between government and courts, and a lot of commentary as well in the last couple of years. They're scheduled to effect January 1st, 2022. And while some on this call may be familiar, this webinar may be familiar with them, I was wondering if we could maybe delve into what the latest status of them is, what they're designed to do, and why I think probably all three of you think they are a bad idea. And Nigel, I'll start with you on that.
Okay.
What are we up against here? What is the industry up against here?
Well, I mean, I think they're designed to reduce drug prices. I mean, the government's quite clear about that. Back in 2017, the then Minister of Health was talking about affordability, accessibility, and appropriate prescribing. And ever since then, really, what we've seen is that affordability is the priority. They're very concerned about prices, and they sort of link everything with the fact that a lot of innovative medicines are quite expensive, and they imply that the drug cost bills that have been increasing are largely due, or almost exclusively due, to those innovative medicines. And they mix the message quite a lot. They talk about people in the some of these people, I can't remember his name now, but the person who bought one of those generic products and jacked up the price several thousand%. And that's got really nothing to do with it. They're just mixing the message, but their main message is we need to bring down drug prices. And to me, the ultimate aim is that's how we might afford national pharmacare, although that's kind of dropped off the edge of the table for now. The federal government has really very few tools in its toolbox to address the prices of drugs. The PMPRB is one of them. And that aligns with the PMPRB's desire, as Richard has said, to make itself less obsolescent. It's over the years, its role has declined. When it began in 1987, it was the only real tool that we had to ensure that prices were not excessive in Canada. But over the years, we've added other tools or hurdles, as John has said. Health technology assessment, which tries to assess the value of a medicine in relation to its cost. It sounds fine in theory, but we have a rather rigid system, again, somewhat hostile system to the industry. And to that, we then added a central price negotiation body, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. And again, that sounds good because we need to, we should have a combined approach. And then indeed the system is being aligned. So we're aligning our HTA system with our price negotiating system. But it's not alignment to me to be a positive, sort of collaborative approach. It's designed to be yet another barrier. And so we've constantly added these barriers. And at the end of the day, as I emphasized before, it's not as though you get a positive recommendation for a product through the HTA. You get an agreed negotiated price. And at the end of the day, you then get, well, okay, we're going to be accepted by public and private insurers. No, the companies then have to go to the provinces and renegotiate. In some cases, it probably goes well, but in other cases, it doesn't. So adding the PMPRB as another barrier, trying to drive down prices by what we've tried to estimate by substantial amounts. We're not talking about a 10% price reduction. We're talking in some cases 50, 60, 70, potentially 80% price reduction. Any company faced with that would say, why would we come to your country? So, it's just yet another barrier.
I guess, John, I see you want to speak. I was going to go to you next because I was going to say that there's the sort of the political / regulatory aspect. There's also a very human aspect to this for families and patients who are waiting for this medication. What do these changes mean for them?
Trouble. If you have an unmet need as a patient or a poorly met need and you need an innovative new therapy, nothing but trouble in the future. That's the signal. In just one little case study, in my son's disease area, PKU, the developer of the first drug therapy has a second drug therapy, and it's been approved in the U.S. It's been approved in Europe, and it's in the pipeline. It's in the bureaucratic process at Health Canada, and they are just starting the HTA process. But the company has made it clear that they have not, even if they get regulatory approval and a positive result out of the health technology assessment process, they will pause and reflect before they will make a decision whether or not to launch it in Canada, because of the cloud over this country caused by the proposed changes in regulations taking effect on the 1st of January. So it's time for the government to pause and reflect. And the whole analysis about doing something as feds within federal jurisdiction was built on two false premises. One is actually the feds don't have jurisdiction over price controls and that's why, for example, it's civil and property rights. It's why doctors and engineers and architects and lawyers are licensed at the private level. And the Federal Court of Appeal has called the PMPR out in a recent decision, which is being appealed. So we have 3 different legal tracks that are on their way to the Supreme Court of Canada. So stay tuned. And it'd be if the feds were smart, they would pause and reflect. Although as a patient advocate, I have to say there is a gap in our system in that patients who aren't represented by group plans, private insurance, or government plans don't have market power. And the out-of-pocket costs for them is something that needs to be addressed creatively by the private sector and by the government sector. And we do have, if we mentioned briefly in passing the concept of national pharmacare, it can mean many different things to many different people. But I would just note that we actually have an effective working model of national pharmacare right now. It's called being an employee of the government of Canada, or a dependent, or a retiree. And you have, through a large group private insurer, you have access to every drug that's been approved by Health Canada, and there is a copay of 20%. That's just, but there are other people, not employees of the government of Canada whose co-pays are 100% because they don't have access to, and we do need, as a patient advocate, we do need to be creative about different ways of filling that gap. Once those folks have access to some kind of insurance for drugs, there will be absolutely no rationale whatsoever remaining to have PMPRB as our price control agency, legal, constitutional, or not. There'll be no practical rationale.
Well, right now, as you said, there's a wide swath of people who don't have access through private plans, either through their workplace or, as you pointed out, the government. But I'm wondering, Richard, in terms of where the conversation on pharmacare is going, because that's come up now a couple of times in our conversation. I think it's an important piece of this. If PMPRB is designed to pave the way, or these changes are designed to pave the way for pharmacare, is there actually, as John says, a better solution to this notion of a simply public funded pharmacare system? Should the government, and how could the government perhaps approach it differently to ensure that private providers, private insurance is part of this mix, that people ultimately, that the patients get what they need, however the means for them to get it?
That's an easy question. Thank you.
I don't mean to throw you the softball, but I didn't think of it that way. I just I have a lot to say.
I better. Yeah, I mean, look, that's actually sort of many questions. Let's look at it in sequence. First of all, is pharmacare necessary? No, absolutely not. We don't need a universal pharmacare program. It would be tremendously wasteful and costly. That doesn't mean we abandon people who can't afford drugs, but more than well over 60% of people in Canada have private insurance, and then of course there's the public sector with their benefits and so on. So to take a universal program, where in fact a targeted program is what we need, would be a very big mistake. Now, but I certainly hear John's calls. I mean, let's address the problem, but let's not use the wrong solutions. I think that pharmacare is, as John said, may have slipped off the table. It's kind of been kept in the offing because it's part of the NDP support for the Liberal government. I don't know how necessary that is, but it's not necessary to have these PMPRB changes to support pharmacare. There may have been some idea that they would be helpful, that the PMPRB, by intervening to affect drug prices at a level that pharmacare could afford, would be seen to sanitize and create a quasi-arm's length approach to drug pricing, a little bit distant from the payor being government. I don't think it would have worked very well. An alternative measure is what we already see in place, which is bulk purchasing that could as easily satisfy the needs of a pharmacare program, which, as I mentioned, we don't need. So it's probably, it was an instigator of the new regulations, but I'm not sure it was very clearly thought through. And in any event, with pharmacare becoming less of a priority, universal pharmacare becoming less of a priority, it's unlikely that the regulations will continue to be pushed for that reason. When the regulations first came out in 2017, a past head of the PMPRB and I wrote a paper explaining the many risks that they created to access to drugs. I've got a couple more papers that will come out, as the last one did, from MLI on that same topic. The PMPRB says ad nauseum, we don't limit access to drugs. People are still going to come here. In light of, people will still register the drugs here. In light of, in fact, at the time, 68 well-documented representations from patient groups and physicians and policy groups explaining the clear opposite. 100% of drug companies surveyed in Canada has said that those new regulations will limit, will constrain, in fact, their decisions, their immediate decisions to bring drugs into Canada. So they simply have to be done away with. But there is the benefit, a twofold benefit to them. One is that in light of the pandemic, the government immediately took PMPRB out of the drug availability loop. It did not approve and still does not approve prices for vaccines or other therapies or devices for to treat COVID-19. So it puts the plain lie to the idea that they don't limit access. Secondly, the regulations, the whole PMPB structure is unconstitutional. The regulations are really unconstitutional. So suddenly what they might have got away with if they just laid low is now on the table, as John says, subject to multiple constitutionality challenges. Again, the sandcastle will collapse.
All right, Nigel, welcome your thoughts on this too, in the sense of where these regulations are going. I mean, they're supposed to take effect January 1st. Do you think that they may not in the current climate? Politically speaking, we've seen pharmacare slide off the table. It was not mentioned in the fall economic statement from the government, lots of other spending, but this one's not there, even though, as was mentioned, the NDP has been championing it for quite a while, and the Liberals are very interested in it as well. So do you think PMPRB is gonna happen or not in this climate?
I'll get my crystal ball out. I think the probability is that it's going to be deferred again because of the cases that are going through at the moment, the constitutional challenge, the other ones which are the appeals against the decision that the PMPRB cannot have access to information about confidential discounts that are provided or offered and negotiated between the provinces and the manufacturers, which really is an integral part of the PMPRB's plan. I just think the probability is that it will be deferred. I think I don't see it being abandoned altogether, which I think a lot of us would like to see. But this government does funny things, strange things, and as everybody's emphasised, the NDP are supporters of pharmacare and so forth. But I don't think we'll know until probably like last year, December the 31st. I believe that it would be sort of just left until that time. I think that's a Friday, I think. So that's a great time to tell everybody that what they're doing. So I think that's my view. I may be wrong. Quite happy, I'm surprised, but I'd be interested to see what other people think.
Yeah, I would too, because announcing Friday at 5 o'clock is always the way if you want people to pay attention to what you're doing. But on the other hand, this creates a lot of uncertainty for drug manufacturers, for patients. It means that once again, it's not clear what will be happening in Canada. What is the impact of that? I mean, we know already that it takes about 3 years for a drug to be approved in the current system. So, John, how concerning is it that there's this continued cloud of uncertainty over what these rules are going to be?
It's a huge concern. I agree with Nigel. I think the nominal public rationale of the government in the previous delays is always, well, everybody's kind of busy focused on COVID, so we don't have time to deal with it. We'll deal with it later, and that spin applies with equal force today as it did 6 months ago or 12 months ago. Thanks to Omicron. 3 years is way too long as a norm for a new molecule for an unmet need going through the many tiers of the process. It's way too long. And the proof of is in the pudding of how things have been expedited when there has been political will and public attention and substantial public need. The viruses of COVID, and then the mutations, and then the prophylactics, the vaccines, and now the therapeutics. We'll see. We need to, instead of that getting things through quickly being the exception, it has to be the norm in terms of access.
All right, and that access is, of course,
and we need to start measuring the metrics on that, because we do have some metrics on some wait lists in certain aspects of Canadian healthcare. We need to start actually having a new metric of how long it takes for a new therapeutic to get to a patient with an unmet need.
Well, I was actually, in terms of that, I was going to say, I know the University of Toronto just came out and said they have a very promising antiviral. It's going to take a couple of years. I think that's probably more from a scientific perspective to put it on the market, to commercialize it for use against COVID. But I'm wondering if that's maybe accelerated the desire to really, deal with this situation, and will it perhaps help in any way turn the tide of public opinion? Because it seems politicians follow public opinion a lot. Do you think that pharmaceutical companies have, they've stepped up? Do you think that's the public perception? Is there perhaps a better impression of them, more willingness to support the kind of work they're doing and not over-regulate as the government, as you're suggesting, would like to do? And do you think that climate could be put to use in any way to either change the way drugs are approved in this country, to deal with PMP regulations, sort of open the floor to that conversation? Are we in a different era because of COVID-19 on this question?
I sure hope so.
Okay. Does anyone else? Richard, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, I think, look, now is the time. I'm not sure it's the attention that the public is focusing on this issue now is going to be enough to actually change the will of the government, but it's a higher profile public issue than it has ever been. It is a matter of life and death. It's all of us, particularly those of us who are beginning to get a little bit older and place greater demands on the healthcare system. We really want to know that the best available drugs are going to be available for us. And hello, everybody, they're not, because the government and its programs are going to prevent that. We're in a situation where there really is no incentive to attenuate regulatory delays for approval of drugs, because it only hastens the need of the government to pay for the resultant therapeutics. And I certainly hope that conflict of interest doesn't really cause delay, but I rather suspect it does. I've seen too many drugs that languish in Health Canada completely unnecessarily, amongst them, for political reasons, effective abortifacients for women, which have delayed medical abortion in this country in a long, unconscionable way. We don't need to do duplicative reviews of every drug. If the US approves a drug, if the European Union approves a drug, there should be a very short form review of that approval and get the drug to market. And drugs that don't reach the provincial formulary or the federal formulary, we should know about which drugs aren't approved here, and we should have access to them as private citizens. So I hope there's a political will to effect some of those changes, but there's simply no need for these delays. And the body politic and our families are going to suffer because of delays, because of lack of access.
If public will is, John, you want to add to that? Just go ahead.
I would, if I may,
Yes.
I'd like to reinforce Richard's point. We represent 2% of the world's spend today, roughly, and less than 2% of the world's population. And we have excellent peer health regulators in the United States and in Europe and in Australia. To me, it's not a good use of our taxpayers' money and our resources for a fully redundant review by a host of officials in Health Canada for the same stuff that's been reviewed by their peers in the United States and by their peers in Switzerland and by their peers in the European Medicines Agency, and in some cases by their peers in Australia. It's completely wrong. It's not trivial to bring a new drug through the regulatory system in any jurisdiction. In Canada, that second drug for my son's rare condition, the submission that's into Health Canada is 10 million pages. Printed out, that would go from Vancouver to Montreal, or weighed, it would be the equivalent of 8 fully grown African elephants. All right. I don't see the value in 60 officials in Health Canada looking at every one of those pages skeptically when all those pages have already been reviewed multiple times by equivalent high-quality health regulators from a safety, efficacy, and quality manufacturing point of view. So one of the biggest changes would be to harmonize the processes with our peers as health regulators around the world, so that there can be a short form review, not a long form review. It ought not, something's that's been reviewed and approved in Europe, America, Switzerland, ought not to go through a 1-year process of looking at 10 million pages with dozens of different officials in Ottawa, right? That would be cut the red tape, please.
You actually preempted my question. I was going to ask that, and I hope it doesn't impinge on our second panel, which is going to be discussing global issues. But has there been, or could there be, more global cooperation between countries? We've seen in COVID times the rapid approval of drugs to deal with vaccines or antivirals to help combat the pandemic. Could there be more cooperation? Would that be a possible answer? And something that the government should look into with its peers around the world to make things go smoother and faster? I'm assuming there'd be some legal hurdles to that too. Maybe Richard, you'd address, but John, I see you want to jump on that one.
I have to acknowledge some of that is taking place, but not enough. All right.
Okay.
And there may need to actually be a new law to say we'll take the evidence of delegated approval from another jurisdiction. But on that point, I defer to Richard.
Okay. The legal guru will weigh in.
Not deserving of deference, but you're quite right. Yes, we should, first of all, implement regulatory changes which do permit, as John says, an expedited review process based upon prior approved regulatory approvals. So just as we do with patents under the PCT treaty, so we would say European drug regulatory reviews are sound, and we will do whatever high-level checks are necessary to introduce drugs in this country on a quick, expedited basis. That will take regulatory change, but it's not hard. It's not hard to do. On the broader research question and innovation question, I think that is one where we really need to put our thinking caps on, because as on an academic research basis, we do generate a lot of life sciences research, and we're actually very well connected internationally. Our universities are quite good at establishing these fairly dense research networks, which avails us almost not at all because none of it gets commercialized in Canada. We will never be able ever to have a domestic pharmaceutical industry that is going to satisfy our needs. Like it's not even a policy that's worth considering. So what we need to do is to become such a valued member of these broader networks of manufacturing and development and research and approvals around the world that we gain a kind of quid pro quo access to everybody else's innovations. And that's going to take some ingenuity. And it's going to take a willingness to admit innovation into this country. But that's where we have to begin to look, because we're not going to be able to protect ourselves and our health otherwise.
Nigel, I know you've been in this space for about 40 years in terms of the research piece. Is that kind of collaboration possible?
It is possible. I mean, Health Canada for many years has been talking about pilot studies of reviews, sort of comparative reviews with the US FDA and the European agencies, Switzerland. But we've not really seen, or at least I haven't seen, the sort of much movement beyond that kind of pilot phase. They talk about it, and Health Canada belongs to a number of multinational associations to talk about those kind of issues. But we've really yet to see any positive outcome, in my opinion, on that. But we do need to do that, and I think there is. I think there's a willingness in some respects, but there's this sort of nervousness that you're, by doing these kind of things and relying on another country or using another country's reviews, you're giving up some sort of sovereign right. And Canada's a bit, well, to me, risk averse and sort of slow in doing that. but it's the way to move forward, because, as I said, we're not a big player. Richard's emphasised that we're not going to have a domestic industry. We certainly have some small companies, brand name companies based here, but we don't have any large ones. But the regulator review really is only part of it. And I mean, when I first started looking at regulatory reviews, the average time to review a drug in Health Canada was around 3 years or so. Some took many years, more than that. That's improved. We're now more consistent with other countries in terms of that review. But availability in the country doesn't necessarily mean accessibility for patients. Company has the drug approved in Canada, and there are ways of speeding that up. There's a notice of compliance with conditions that will allow you. There are fast track possibilities through Health Canada. But what's the point if it then says, well, it goes through to Health Technology Assessment, who says, well, there's not a big enough clinical trial here. We don't like that. We're going to give it a negative recommendation, which then effectively means it's not going to be price negotiated unless there's some active lobbying of the manufacturers, maybe. And down the road, the provincial governments are looking at it and saying, well, no, we don't want that. So, making a drug available, if you're then doing that and then saying, well, we're okay, maybe we can get it through Health Technology Assessment, we can get a price negotiation, but we really want you to reduce that price by 80%. Why on earth would anybody come here? It just doesn't make any sense. And the government sort of doesn't see that. It doesn't really get that impact on patients. It maybe gets it in terms of cancer patients, but in lots of other areas, no.
Richard, I see you nodding very vigorously on that one.
It's lovely to be in a panel with people one agrees with so much. I just want to quickly underscore John's point and give a nod to his great work on estimating the effects on prices of the new PMPRB regulations, which are indeed catastrophically confiscatory of drug price value. Why would drug companies come here? Indeed, we are just not appealing, and keeping the expensive treatments out means nobody has to pay for them, and we all accept a truncated healthcare system. But the thing is, drugs are not expensive in this country. PMPRB and others make a lot of noise about ours being amongst the highest drug prices in the world, which is sort of true, but it's by about that much. The US prices are up here. They're 3.5 times what ours are on average. And these figures are very difficult to work with. It's a very messy international market for drugs, but still, data show 3.5 times what Canada's are. Those are high drug prices. They're high because we won't pay, by the way. So we import consumer surpluses from the United States consumers, which is totally unfair and immoral. Other countries do it too. But the idea that somehow drug prices are out of control and we need PMPRB to step in, this simply isn't true. Drugs are priced abundantly fairly. In fact, they are heavily subsidized in this country already.
That maybe the case. A lot of people. I see John talking on mute again. I was going to come to you, John, but a lot of the public perception is when you hear, as a drug. I think the drug that was in question in the actual lawsuit, I'm going to pronounce probably wrong. Oh, actually not. Solaris. Treatment for a year, $500,000 to $700,000. When people hear that, they say, "Well, how can that be fair?" So,
Right.
How do you make that bridge to government to say, well, there's a reason the drug is so costly and should be compensated, or we won't get it? Is that possible?
2 points. When you get to very rare diseases, the cost of recouping the research and development and making a fair profit on a new product it may look high on a per patient basis, but because when there are very few patients, it's actually quite sustainable and affordable. It's not a budget buster. Second point is I'm a little jaded about the dramatics in the theater of sticker price shock, because let me use the example of buying a new car. You can go to the new car dealer and you can, if you choose to, accept the first price that the sales representative happens to mention, the manufacturer's suggested list price. If you do, you have more money than brains. And you expect, but that's an individual consumer, one car, one consumer, one dealer. It's a little more tricky about negotiating that, but we have mechanisms, both private insurance industry and the government drug plans have mechanisms now in place to negotiate a price. I leave it to, and I expect those private insurers and those government plans to do a good job of extracting a value reduction in it. All right, I don't have a problem with that. But the issue here is that's mutual consent between the drug maker and the drug buyers. All right, and that's what the open market is about. The problem is when you have the heavy hand of government tipping the scale by bringing in price regulations. Right.
I want to go back quickly because we only have a few minutes left in this panel to a question that's kind of forward-looking. And John, you already addressed it in your opening remarks, which is whether there should be some kind of inquiry into the way the pandemic was handled. I guess from focusing here in this case on the availability of medications and vaccines and innovation itself. So I'd like to put it to other two panelists, in closing. So looking forward, would such inquiry be helpful? And if so, what would his goals be for Canada and for the industry as well? Richard, and I would start with you.
Thanks. I would say, no, it's fine. No, here I go. I would say no and yes. No, because the whole mess of the pandemic is still very fresh in our minds. The carnage of bad decisions, endlessly uncorrected decisions, poor communication, lack of innovation, bad relations with the pharmaceutical industry, the incredibly poor judgment to negotiate a deal with China, the riding roughshod over our rights and freedoms, the enormous economic costs. Look, all this carnage it's about us on the streets. It's obvious to everybody that this couldn't have been handled worse. So I don't know what we need an inquiry for. However, people's memories are short, and to follow this on with a disciplined inquiry that will draw the right conclusions and hopefully make policy recommendations soon enough that they'll have some force of political will behind them. It's probably worth doing. I don't know who in this country would do it, frankly, but let's maybe we can bring in somebody more objective. But it needs a forceful and fundamental approach, a critique to generate the political changes that are necessary.
All right, Nigel, you get the last word on that, and I think probably for this panel too, which is, do we need an inquiry? Is that the way to learn our lessons here? And so why do we do it?
I agree with Richard that I'm sort of ambivalent to that. If we did have one, it would have to be headed up by somebody outside in the country in many ways, because we don't want another liberal, I don't like to use the word hack, but another liberal leading it. And I'm sort of ambivalent also because I'm not sure what the benefits will be. I support Richard. We can see the problems. It would also have to be a wider examination, not just focused on COVID-19. It's looking at the whole pharmaceutical environment issues and innovation. It needs to be broader, and it needs to have some power behind it. That's my take. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to thank all three of you so much for giving us these lessons learned about COVID-19 and Canada's experience in the innovation space or lack of innovation and where things are going. I want to thank you very much, John Adams, Richard Owens, and Nigel Rawson for joining us. And for everyone who's still here, please stick around because we are now going to be going to our second panel talking about lessons learned for the globe, which of course involves Canada as well. We have been facing an unprecedented situation with regard to the global access or inequity of access to vaccines and medicines. Here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, again, for anyone who's just joining us for the second hour, welcome on their behalf. I'm Tasha Kheiriddin, your host for the second panel as well. I'm with Navigator Limited and also a national political columnist for the National Post and Post Media, and very interested in these questions because, as everyone here in this webinar, our lives have been turned upside down by the COVID-19 pandemic, and access, equity, these questions have become top of mind, especially as we've seen the Omicron variant now take hold around the world and calls for increased vaccination and access to medicines for developing countries where more variants perhaps risk coming out when people have not received their vaccines. So to talk about those issues, to talk about Canada's place in this, and also sort of a larger question of global resilience and vaccine supplies, really pleased to be joined by two panelists today. Mark Schultz, our first guest, is a professor of law at the University of Akron Law School, where he is the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company Chair in Intellectual Property and Director of the Center for Intellectual Property Law and Technology. He has testified in front of U.S. Congress and many other bodies on patent issues, as well as worked in universities and think tanks. And he recently authored a publication called Trade Secrecy and COVID-19, How Trade Secrets and Other IPRs Underpin Innovation and Manufacturing of COVID. So welcome. Christina Acri, our second panelist, is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and associate professor of economics and chair at the Department of Economics and Business at Colorado College in Colorado Springs. So you have two people here who probably have much better weather than we do in Canada. I don't know. Her research focuses largely on issues related to IP rights protection, with a particular focus on pharmaceutical-related intellectual property. And her recent publications include an evaluation of IP protection for pharmaceutical products based on international best practices and examinations of alternatives to the existing patent system. So welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us. Our last panel was talking a lot about barriers in Canada to access and development of new medicines and innovation. But I want to ask you what the lessons are learned in the rest of the world from the COVID-19 experience. What are the lessons learned there about these issues? And I'll start with you, Christina.
Thank you, Tasha. It's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this event. I want to start with a few thoughts on the economics of intellectual property in the context of the pandemic in particular. The pandemic has provided us with an opportunity to examine the role of IP in the biopharmaceutical sector in action. There are inherent challenges to drug development. It is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's risky. The average cost of developing a new drug is closing in on $3 billion. Admittedly, this is a controversial number, but even if it's half that amount, it's still a tremendous amount of money. In addition, only 12% of medicines that go into clinical trials are ultimately approved. The science is difficult and it's uncertain. As a result, it's important to incentivize this research and make sure that it happens. And this is the role that intellectual property plays. IP has enhanced the biopharmaceuticals industry's result and their response to the pandemic and spurred collaboration. There's a mistaken narrative that there's a conflict between IP access and medicine, and that's absolutely false. Critics argue that patents and other forms of IP rights hinder access and production, but reality paints a much, much different picture. Historically, vaccine development has taken decades. And in the case of COVID and the pandemic, Moderna was able to develop a vaccine so very, very quickly because of their intellectual property rights and the investments that led to the mRNA platform. Intellectual property facilitated these vaccines coming to market so brilliantly and so quickly. IP plays a useful role in showing researchers what else is out there, and it encourages sharing and collaboration, even amongst rivals. IP encourages improvements and continued investment because it provides safeguards for the innovators, allowing them to select partners that can manufacture to the highest quality, making sure that they are safe and promoting public confidence in the vaccines that they do make. The knowledge that's able to be shared under voluntary licensing agreements allows for more rapid cooperation, and we've seen this in the cases of rapidly promoting access to innovative medicines, particularly in low and middle income countries, notably for hepatitis C and HIV medicines. The approach is sustainable and it's effective, highly effective. Moreover, it allows for the rapid knowledge transfer that would not happen under coercion. Thanks in part to our IP system, there is a dynamic, competitive market in COVID vaccines. Numerous vaccines have been approved, and hundreds of other vaccines and antiviral therapies are under development globally. Competition across the vaccines has facilitated delivery and effective dosing and has kept vaccine prices low. COVID vaccine manufacturing is highly complex, and the ongoing challenges that the global community must face can be traced not to IP, but to other compounding factors. Shortages of input materials and ingredients, production challenges, scaling up manufacturing, the lack of proper refrigeration, shortages in trained personnel, and a lack of patient compliance. Suspending patents and other IP fixes none of these. Suspension only exacerbates these problems. IP has facilitated our quick response to the pandemic, and it's essential to ensuring that innovative treatments and cures continue to be developed. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share my thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Christina. And Mark, to build on what Christina said, what are the greatest lessons that you feel we have learned from COVID-19 in terms of innovation, in terms of development? Is IP the cornerstone for this, in your view?
Sure, thanks. Glad to be here. And so I think there are a few lessons, and they link to IP. IP isn't the main cause of why we have vaccines. That comes down to great science and business risk taking and some good public policy decisions. I know we can criticize a lot of public policy decisions, and we have in this webinar, and there's much that deserves to be criticized, but there have been some good timely decisions. So, I think the first lesson is that we're lucky. We've been lucky in the foundation of innovation that we had. Now that luck, luck is when, people say luck is when preparation meets opportunity, or in this case, necessity. And we were prepared only because companies had been investing in what had for a long time had seemed dubious technology. It had a lot of critics. mRNA technology, a lot of people said it was a dead end, that it wouldn't work. One of the main academic proponents of mRNA vaccines, Katalin Kariko, her career almost reached a dead end at the University of Pennsylvania back in the 90s when she was pursuing this research. She persevered, and so did other researchers. And they made some of the key breakthroughs in basic science by the early 2000s that enabled that made mRNA vaccines a possibility. So we've had a long history, particularly in the United States and Europe and Canada, of funding basic research, and it's important. Although people often mistake the government funding of basic research for as if it's the only thing that was needed. By the early 2000s, we had the basic breakthroughs that would enable mRNA vaccines. We also had long had the science and possibility of creating viral vector vaccines, such as J&J and AstraZeneca. But in order to develop these further, particularly the mRNA vaccines, that we needed private companies to take risks. So Moderna was founded by around 2010. BioNTech, which has partnered with Pfizer, had been working in this area as well. And they raised billions of dollars in private investment. And they worked on the problem for another 10 years, because that's what it takes. Basic science is great. Everything's driven by great science in this field. But actually getting treatments to patients takes a different team of people that understand how to translate the lab breakthroughs into treatments for patients, which is a long and difficult road that takes more investment in science, takes knowledge of how to do clinical trials and the willingness to invest in them. And it takes knowledge of how to clear regulatory hurdles, how to manufacture the treatments, and how to get them to patients. And what we were fortunate in as 2020 dawned, although we faced a tremendous challenge, the development of mRNA technology was at just the right point to make this a possibility, to make vaccines a possibility. But that was only because of decades of private investment. The same with viral vector vaccines like J&J and AstraZeneca. Those had only ever been approved as a vaccine treatment for use in humans as of summer of 2020. There was an Ebola vaccine. So this is all new technology. It's science that had been around for a while, but the actual applied science took a lot of investment, which leads me to the second point, is that another lesson is that first we have this great legacy of innovation that had been built for decades by private investment. The second lesson is that private investment was essential. It's remained essential. It was essential in developing the foundational technology. It has been essential in developing the manufacturing capabilities and getting drugs to patients. The private sector has invested billions of that and worked around the clock to do it. The public sector did support this investment. How did they support it? Well, one of the most important things the public sector did was in some key targeted subsidies, yes, but also what the public sector did, what governments did, is they made advanced purchase commitments. Now, in past pandemics, like the H1N1 pandemic, governments had encouraged pharma manufacturers to develop vaccines. That particular pandemic, fortunately, at the time proved to be not as big of a threat as people feared initially. And so the governments essentially decided not to purchase the vaccines, and money was lost by pharma companies. So what the advanced purchase commitments reassured companies of was that if they developed a successful vaccine, which was a big if, in hindsight, it seems inevitable, but it was a big if, whether it would happen. If they developed the vaccine, the governments committed to purchase them. And that assured them that the governments wouldn't prefer one vaccine to the other because, say, there was a 5% difference in efficacy or political connections or all the other kinds of things that may affect a government purchase decision. And so this was an important intervention by governments to support the private market. Now, it also has created some distortions at the end because it's put some of those governments ahead in line for doses. And we can talk about that later. It has, but at the front end, that those advanced purchase commitments were really important. Now, so far, I've talked about innovation and investment. All of those things are fundamentally enabled by IP. Why? Because investment comes from private parties. Private parties have choices about where to put their money. They don't make these choices out of spite or whim. They're often charged with great responsibilities when investing other people's money. It may be people's pension funds. It's people's investment funds. It's the funds of universities and other charitable institutions, or it's just people trying to provide for their families and make a good plan for retirement. And so when this money gets invested, it has to be invested responsibly. People and institutions need to believe they have a prospect of a return on their investment. Intellectual property gives them that prospect, secures that investment. It doesn't give them any guarantees. Most pharmaceutical products fail. Most investments in biopharma fail. but a few succeed. Now, the one risk that investors can't tolerate, because they know if they're investing in this field, they need to tolerate the rest. But the one thing they can't tolerate is that success will cause their investment to be taken away. And I'll wrap this up now. I also think we need to discuss collaboration. That has occurred on a global basis, and that's something people don't understand. No one company could do this alone. I spent the summer doing research, talking to chief IP counsel and manufacturing experts from the leading vaccine manufacturers, and none of them had the capacity to make the vaccine on their own. They partnered with everyone they could find who had the capacity to do so. In many instances, they partnered with some of their biggest competitors. Why? Because this was a global emergency. How could they do so? Because they had the assurance that intellectual property rights protected their rights. Time and again, they all cited the fact that intellectual property rights gave them assurance that they could team up with competitors, that they could transfer their secrets, that they could collaborate, knowing that they had the backup of legal rights if things went sour. If somebody took something they weren't supposed to, it was a deterrent to people misusing the knowledge. And this is what fueled our response. The foundation of innovation, the investment, and the collaboration, all secured by intellectual property. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Christina, I want to move to some questions, and I'll just remind also everyone who's watching, if you have questions for our guests, please put them in the chat. I'd be happy to include them in the mix of our discussion in this hour. Christina, I want to take off where Mark left there, which is with regard to IP's role in this collaboration. In an earlier panel, we also talked about the importance of collaboration in general between countries to speed up the regulatory and approvals process. With COVID, of course, we did that at light speed. And I'm wondering, in terms of the role of IP and maybe some specific examples, how that was so crucial in your view to enabling this collaboration, and maybe for future pandemics or even in other situations where drug breakthroughs occur, how IP protection could be structured to make sure that collaboration is encouraged rather than discouraged.
Thank you, Tasha. I think that Mark has done excellent work in this area and has laid the groundwork, teeing things up for me here. I think that the collaboration that takes place is guaranteed by IP rights. That's what protects the innovation that has happened, and that's what gives innovators the security that it's safe to make these efforts to reveal this knowledge, to share this technology with other companies, as Mark said, in some cases, direct competitors. And that's all guaranteed by the fact that there is a legal safeguard in the intellectual property structure, architecture that exists for us. I don't think that we can argue that there's a better system out there. I think there are a number that have been proposed and thought about, but the advances that we have are here because of the system we have today. I think that strong IP rights in terms of data exclusivity, in terms of patents and trade secret protection, are the things that enable countries to be willing to go to the table and seek out partners for the advances that they can't do by themselves. So it's that collaboration that has brought us forward, and the collaboration has been facilitated by the fact that this knowledge is secured with strong IP rights that exist.
And what could make a country an attractive partner in that respect? We hear about the idea of waiving COVID vaccine patent protection, for example. There are calls for a sort of democratization, if you will, of intellectual property because of the pandemic. Is that something that would make it more or less attractive in the current context if a country were to do that, or would they be shut out of perhaps future development because companies would be afraid that could happen to them? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, and then I would ask Mark as well if he has some to build on that too.
I think the vaccine waiver is a bad idea and a dangerous idea. I think, first of all, there's no real way to compel a company to reveal everything that you would need in order to go ahead with vaccine production on your own. There are so many steps in the process that just handing over the patent isn't going to be enough. There's tacit knowledge that is needed there. There's training, there's specialized equipment that all have to be put in place for vaccines to be produced in other countries. And I think you're exactly right about the fact that this would have a chilling effect on future innovation and collaboration. Companies and innovators would be reluctant to seek out these partnerships to advance knowledge through this cooperation if they didn't believe that their investments were safe, that their knowledge would earn them a return, that they would be able to capitalize on it as they had planned.
Mark, what are your thoughts on the proposed vaccine waiver that some are calling for? And you're on mute.
So this is really putting the focus in the wrong place, and in a lot of ways, the call for the vaccine waiver was tellingly premature at one point, because people were demanding demanding the IP waiver before we even had vaccines developed, and now it's still around over 16 months later, but now it's becoming old news. Why? Because I think we're moving from the phase where we need to worry about getting enough vaccines made to getting vaccinations in people's arms. And this shows, I guess, a problem we seem to have in public policy that leads to IP often being cast as the villain. There's kind of a centralized mindset that we can, a belief that we can solve the global challenges, global health challenges in conference rooms in Geneva. And that's just not the case. It's a centralized mindset that says, let's look for an easy solution. And we're humans. We like stories. We like stories with heroes and villains. So for some reason, let's cast the pharma companies as villains. That story goes, I think, sometimes. They're withholding knowledge. In fact, this is probably the finest moment of the global biopharma industry. They've come to our rescue. Yes, they're making a profit. That's how the system works. But ultimately, the making enough vaccines has not proven to be the problem. The problems have included vaccine nationalism. And ultimately, what we're seeing now is the fundamental problem of logistics. We need to better distribute this effort among countries. We need to tap local expertise. We need to develop local knowledge, and we need to innovate locally. Look, I hope this isn't overly simplifying things, but think of something like Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is famous for getting its product into the most remote villages in the world. And Coca-Cola doesn't figure out how to do that in a conference room in Geneva or Atlanta, Georgia. It doesn't make all of its Coca-Cola in one place and then just ship it out to docks around the world and hope it gets to people. Coca-Cola adapts itself to local conditions. I've seen Coca-Cola distribution happening on, strapped to the backs of donkeys, going across deserts on camels. And I've seen Coca-Cola advertising in informal settlements in developing countries. This is the kind of outreach we need for public health. For a much more important and essential issue, we need to figure out how to ship cold vaccines into some of the remotest places in the world and convince people and educate people about the importance of getting these vaccines. It's time to turn vaccines into vaccinations. And that's where we as a global community are failing now. It's not on producing enough vaccines. It's on equitably distributing them. The wealthy countries who were first in line have enough, and they have enough prospectively for boosters. They need to start letting those vaccines be distributed elsewhere, and that's happening. And then we need to focus on creating a better global health infrastructure. The last thing I'll note is the WHO over the years has cited a frequent problem as being, about 2 billion people in the world have no access to healthcare. We're not talking about easy access, regular access. We're talking about no access to healthcare. That's what we need to build up as a global community. We need to get shots in arms, and we need to work with people with local knowledge. We need to innovate locally, and we need to work locally. It's hard. It's not as pleasant as talking in a climate-controlled conference room in Geneva, but it's the necessary work of treating real people.
I hear a lot of Geneva bashing here. And so I'm curious, Christina, in terms of the way, the World Health Organization has advised and handled this pandemic from the vaccine distribution point of view or the IP point of view. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, I guess, some maybe their politics around access to vaccine and even the way that people are perceiving the vaccine. Because you alluded to this, you said, and Mark also, that there's a profit motive, and so people look askance and they say, well, this is just to make money for the pharma companies. They want us to now get a third dose, and in some cases even a fourth dose, and so on and so on. How has this played out, and how can one combat perceptions that IP is about making money versus getting shots into arms, as Mark just said?
I think IP is about making money. I think without those initial investments, we wouldn't have the drugs and the vaccines that we've got. And those were not efforts that were motivated solely by good intentions. There was a profit motive that motivated this entire process, that put the wheels in motion. And that's not a bad thing. We are a lot healthier 2 years into the pandemic because of that. And there should be a reward for taking those risks and making those investments and bringing us the drugs that we need. I think in terms of bashing the WHO, in terms of the stories that we tell about IP and vaccine hesitancy, I think one of the problems that we have is that we like stories, as Mark has said, but we also like simple stories. And knowing the difficult details of the work that goes into developing these vaccines and the complicated stories on how distribution takes place, the truth behind the advanced purchase commitments is an excellent example. That's seen as hoarding instead of being seen as the thing that actually facilitated these investments to take place. It's a lot easier to latch on to the hoarding story than to recognize that these complicated negotiations actually gave companies the security to move forward in a risky, difficult environment. But I think that it's easier to latch on to the simple story and as Mark said, to pick out a villain and point to them as the cause of all bad things that happen. And resolving that is going to take a lot of work. And it's going to take some people and events like this one, where the more complicated stories can be aired out and people start to listen to what the actual details are rather than just latching on to what's easy.
Mark, let me ask you about some of the barriers that we face in terms of distribution. You mentioned, Coca-Cola on the back of a donkey versus the refrigeration. I don't know if the donkey can carry the refrigerator too that's needed for the vaccines, but the differences in distribution, the disparity is of course due to difficulty also in distribution in the developing world versus the developed world. So I'd like to start a conversation there, and Christina, I'll ask you your views as well about how those differences, first of all, and how we help bridge them to increase vaccine access in the developing world versus the barriers we have in the developed world, which seem to be more centered around refusal of vaccine.
Sure. So, there are a lot of problems that wealth solves. And so, wealthy countries have been able to overcome those by getting their own purchase commitments. If in a smaller country, particularly a smaller low-income country, they don't have that purchasing power. They don't have those resources. So one thing that a number of people in the global health community did wisely was they launched COVAX. Unfortunately, that's COVAX. COVAX was an alliance led by a few key intergovernmental organizations as well as NGOs, including the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, Innovations, the Global Vaccine Initiative, Gavi, the WHO, with a lot of support from the backing and support from the Gates Foundation. And their goal was to identify, buy, and deliver vaccines to lower and middle income countries. It was a good idea. It's a good idea to pool purchasing power. particularly if you're, say, a country like Malawi or with limited resources, just to take an example. You're really going to have a hard time reaching those pharma companies, negotiating with them, and having the purchasing power to buy what you need. And indeed, what are some of the issues they had to negotiate? Well, there's regulatory clearance. We talked about that on the first panel. There's the challenge of liability waivers. These vaccines were being offered on an emergency basis. The goal is to vaccinate all of humanity. And you can just imagine the tremendous liability exposure, even if nothing goes wrong, just getting sued and potentially being able to be sued in every country in the world is a barrier to innovation. And so they had to work together to negotiate this issue. And so that went well. Unfortunately, it was a great idea. It was an A+ idea, as one global public health commentator said, and the execution gets a C. There was insufficient early financing. That was a problem. Vaccine nationalism has proven to be a challenge. I think as Christina and I both vehemently agree, the early advanced purchase commitments were key to actually making the vaccines happen. But they did put wealthy countries ahead in line. There was a big reliance on the Serum Institute of India. And despite India's advocacy of an IP waiver, the odd thing that happened is the Serum Institute was prohibited by the government of India from exporting vaccines because of India's own COVID public health crisis. So India has spoken really with two positions on this very issue. Its actions have belied its policy advocacy, and now we're at the stage though where yes, we're having cold chain problems, and that takes, for example, keeping the vaccines cold, and that probably a lot of people are looking at those issues now and saying, we should have from the very start been building up local infrastructure, talking to local people, looking into innovations that address local challenges. And the cold chain problem has been there all along with vaccines, long before COVID. The mRNA vaccines have particularly demanding cold chain requirements. But when I was working on this issue several years ago, before the pandemic, the Gates Foundation, I observed that the Gates Foundation had funded an innovative vaccine cooler, a patented vaccine cooler that was purchased by the Gates Foundation, and it could keep vaccines cool for 30 days. And yes, just like I have pictures of Coca-Cola strapped to the backs of donkeys and camels, I have pictures of these vaccine coolers going across the desert on the camel back. And that's what, that's the part of the chain we didn't focus on enough at the beginning, that last 50 to 100 miles. And we need to work on that as a global community. So I think these are some of the lessons we've learned. Great idea to pull purchasing power, negotiate regulatory and liability requirements collectively, but then we need sufficient funding, and we need to focus a lot more on local expertise, local participation, and local innovation.
So I stand corrected on those images I said of the refrigerator on the back of the donkey. That's wonderful to know. And yet at the same time, we know that there are a lot of challenges still. So Christina, in terms of the challenges of the developing world versus the developed world, and we have some in the developed world too, in terms of vaccine hesitancy that are in some parts centered around this notion that this is just, I hate to use the word conspiracy, but some people do, to either profit to the pharmaceutical industry or do other nefarious things. Welcome your thoughts too on how lessons we've learned about overcoming those challenges in both the developing and developed world and what we could do taking those forward.
Thank you. I think that Mark's given us an excellent description of what the primary challenges are. I have very little to add to his list. I think that that one of the things that we do see is a shortage of trained personnel. So we need to have healthcare professionals all over the world who are able to deliver these medicines and administer shots in the arms that are willing and able. Vaccine hesitancy is a bit beyond my pay grade. I'm not really sure how we overcome that. It's truly a significant problem. It's definitely something that is inhibiting us from getting beyond the pandemic, moving into a post-pandemic world. I don't really have any good answers for that. I think one of the other challenges that we've faced comes into play in terms of the supply chain. These are very complicated vaccines that require a number of ingredients and inputs to production that have been hard to come by and difficult to produce. And facilitating that on a global level, I think, would also help us both in making sure that there are enough vaccines available globally, as well as putting us in a better position to be prepared for the next pandemic or the next medicines that we need on a global scale.
Yeah, so the last panel talked about next pandemic too, which, like I said, makes me twitchy. I see, Mark, that you wanted to jump in there with something to build on that.
Yeah, just briefly, on that profit-making point, yes, after developing a successful vaccine, which was by no means guaranteed, that we have this hindsight bias. Because it worked, we think it would have worked. Yes, Pfizer's making money on this. Some companies took a big risk and failed. Merck's vaccine didn't work out. They took a big charge against their fourth quarter profits in 2020 because of their vaccine failures. So there was risk taking here. And there's also a bit of a risk in developing something that's so needed in the political climate. When it came to testing existing drugs for efficacy against COVID, a lot of companies jumped in with both feet. I noticed that maybe a couple were noticeably absent when I talked to their policy people. They certainly never said we were uninterested. They said, well, we didn't think we had anything that worked. And I said, well, could it have been more trouble than it was worth? And they said, well, we don't want to say that. But sometimes it seems like if we develop something that's really good and necessary, it's more, we end up being vilified and people want to take our stuff away. We don't want to incentivize pharma to focus solely on erectile dysfunction drugs or hair loss drugs, right? We want them to make life-saving treatments. They could probably make more money and nobody will ever call them a bad name if they just focus on lifestyle drugs. But they also know they're also on a mission to save lives. Yes, they make money, but people who go into this business, a lot of them really do believe in what they're doing. And I guess that's one point I want to make from all the interviews I did this past summer with people from these companies. A lot of them said, look, don't say that we won't step up if you take away our IP. Like, well, it's a talking point. It's a policy talking point. But it's really not true. It's what we do. We make life-saving treatments. But if you threaten our IP and continue to take it away, we'll work in different ways that won't be as helpful. Because we first of all, the little guys, the startup companies that were so important here, BioNTech and Moderna, the venture capitalists just aren't going to fund them if they think that success means having your IP and property taken away. Those companies won't exist. And they were key to this battle. And the second thing is these companies said, look, we'll still work on life-saving treatments, but there may be countries we can't collaborate in because they threaten to take away our IP. We may be less able to partner with competitors if we can't rely on our IP. We're going to be more careful about holding our information proprietary and collaborating less. And it's not out of spite, they said. It's because we owe duties to our investors, because we owe duties to our the people we employ. Because in some instances, there are concerns about national competitiveness, the not wanting to give away cutting edge technology to, competing nations. Because of all those reasons, if you threaten IP, you will get a less effective system. Biopharma companies will still do biopharma work, but not at the volume we would like and not with the resources we would like and not collaborating like we want them to. Thanks.
Christina, to build on that point in terms of where IP is at, obviously IP protection varies from country to country, and I'm wondering if you feel that the experience of the pandemic is going to spur greater protection for IP or the reverse. And if there are countries you would point to that have a better system that you feel that encourages this kind of innovation and kind of risk taking that maybe here in Canada we could look to?
I think that there will be arguments on both sides of that. I think that there will be those who say that this is a perfect example of why we shouldn't have intellectual property rights, and that everyone in the world would be getting vaccines and getting them quicker if only this barrier did not exist. I disagree with that position, but I think it's something that you are going to hear. It's something that we currently hear. And on the other side, I think that there will be those that will be able to step up and say that IP is the reason that these investments were put into place, that the tremendous science that we have seen was able to move forward at such a rapid pace, and that it's IP that protected those things and brought us the drugs that we've got that are now helping us to get a handle on the pandemic. So I think there will be those who advocate at both ends of that spectrum. I believe that the systems that we have in place are working. I think that without IP, we wouldn't have seen these drugs come to market and get into arms as quickly as they have. Years ago, I heard a statistic that there are more drugs invented in New Jersey than in all the other countries on Earth. And I think that may not be true any longer, but I think that the moral of the story is that the strong IP rights that we have in place in the United States do facilitate this investment. They allow companies to take on the risk, to put the time into these things, and to make the tremendous investment of funds that are necessary for developing new medicines, treatments, and cures. And I think there's a lesson there that we can apply to other places, that it may not be that you adopt the US system wholeheartedly, but you can tinker around the edges to improve your system and adopt some of the things that we know are working in the US.
Okay, Mark, would you echo that? And I just also throw in one other wrinkle in the sense that, of course, we have different legal systems around the world, different levels of government involvement in the legal system too, or how fair legal systems are seen to be in terms of protecting contractual rights or IP or any other private interests. A large part of the world doesn't have a legal system comparable. I'm thinking, for example, in China and other nations where you would not see that kind of protection. And so in terms of, I guess, the political side of this, do you think that it will cause a greater demand maybe for change, even within systems that might be quite rigid, to say, if we really want innovation, then we need to give the private sector and IP a greater role? Could that be beneficial from a sort of a geopolitical standpoint as well, to see what's happened in this pandemic and how IP and that protection has really helped produce the vaccines that are getting us out of literally out of our homes? And you're on mute.
I'm not necessarily optimistic that it will persuade anyone once and for all. I think what the pandemic has done is surfaced a debate that has been going for many years about the role of IP. There's some pretty strong ideology that is skeptical of IP, and I think some of it stems from, I guess, two things. It's kind of a focus on the current moment. If we look at drugs, what we have to understand, if we look at drug patents, is they expire. They all expire. And essentially every drug that we use in the global formulary, except maybe for a couple Chinese herbal medicines, was developed as a patented drug. And the vast, vast majority, 95, 98% of the drugs we use today are no longer under patent. It takes a long time to develop a drug. By the time it actually comes to market, it usually only has about 5 to 10 years of effective patent life. It's a pretty big bargain to protect a drug for just a handful of years, and then to be able to make a generic of it for the rest of eternity. And we benefit from that. And yet I think the global community, sometimes many in the global community, they're either so focused on current needs that they say, damn the future. We have needs now. We need those drugs cheap and free now. We can't wait. And I understand that. I understand the humanitarian urge. But sometimes I think we need to ask ourselves, not just as a question of economics, which is important, not just as a question of innovation economics, but as a question of intergenerational ethics. What do we owe our future selves? What do we owe future generations? We owe them that to keep this engine of innovation and ever improving health going. We owe them that brief window where these drugs are protected from the property of intellectual property of a particular company for the future generations of benefits and accrued innovation we get. So I hope people can understand that better. We're making the case. It's getting more public. It's getting more important. But there are two sides to the debate. And I think there is this sort of very short-sighted focus on current needs, which is very compelling in a humanitarian manner. But I think there are other ways to meet humanitarian needs than destroying the system that has given us innovation and will give our children innovation and better cures.
If we could maybe talk a bit about the philanthropic. You mentioned humanitarian, but we've talked a lot about the roles of government and the private sector. But there's also other actors, such as the Gates Foundation, which you mentioned, and the sort of the philanthropic movements that have taken it upon themselves to assist with vaccine efforts, and not just for COVID, obviously. The Gates vaccination programs have been pre-existing for quite a while. How do you see the intersection between those three, and could the philanthropic side, how do you feel they come down in terms of the need for IP protection or not, how they see things and their role in the future development of that area of the law? So Christine, I'll start with you on that.
I think that there's an image that people have that all drugs are developed by large biotech multinational pharmaceutical companies. And that's not entirely true. There are innovations that come out of much smaller organizations and out of philanthropic organizations that are then patented and used for the betterment of health worldwide. I think that what we have to focus on is not where these innovations come from, but what incentivizes them and what will enable us to bring more of them into existence and to the people who need them. I think that the philanthropic organizations definitely fill a need, that there is a gap there, especially for the most vulnerable among us. And I think that they do their job and they do it well. Big Pharma does their job and they do it well. I think we need to see collaboration there and cooperation, but I think there's a role for each of them in making sure that the benefits to innovation and global health are spread more widely across all of us, across all countries and all populations. Thank you.
All right. Mark, what's your view on the involvement of the philanthropic sector in this, in future pandemic vaccination plans or others?
Well, they're a key partner, and the Gates Foundation has done so much good in the world in this regard. And, it reminds me that years ago, I happened to be going to a conference on IP and drug innovation, and I got stuck on a shuttle from the airport to the particular university. It was a long shuttle ride. And I happened to find I was riding with somebody whose job was working for NGOs, setting up distribution systems in developing countries for HIV drugs. And so I said, well, let me ask you, I told her what, the conference I was going to, I said, people worry about patents and the price of antiretrovirals. And she scoffed. She was something of a force of nature, but she said, between the NGOs and between persuading pharma companies, I can get the drugs I need for people. She said, it's getting them to the people that's my problem. And she just proceeded to describe the challenges she had in the farthest reaches of Botswana, for example, going to a clinic, arriving there and finding that the nurses and doctors had all died. And she had to train the janitor how to distribute the drugs and educate people, finding ways to get drugs to remote sections of Papua New Guinea, and what that took in terms of trucks and personnel and the like. And what she emphasized to me was that, what people argue about, once again, in conference rooms, is not what the problem with getting drugs to patients. We need to focus on the sort of dirty, unpleasant, nitty-gritty, hard work, puzzling work, logistical work of getting drugs to patients. And yes, the philanthropic community can play an important role in that. as well as in acting as a purchasing agent, in working as a partner with pharma to ensure that the poorest countries get the drugs they need while pharma can keep the market it has in wealthy countries. I think that's how we make the system work. But we need to focus on the everyday issues, the challenges of getting drugs to patients, not getting drugs to the docs of these countries.
Okay, so let me ask you, we're going to wrap up with a final question or a final round, looking forward, looking ahead to, I hope not, but the next pandemic, and building that resiliency. We've mentioned the partners that are involved. Ultimately, a lot of these decisions are made, though, in terms of those last miles too, by leadership, political leadership in various countries. So if you were talking to world leaders today, what would you say would be the biggest lesson or takeaway they should take forward from this pandemic about the rapid development and production and distribution of vaccines, all the issues we've been talking about? What would you say, for example, if you had Joe Biden sitting in front of you, or I was going to say Angela Merkel, but she's not there anymore, or the president of South Africa, or anybody, what would you say is the lesson that really we should take away for when this unfortunately does eventually happen again? And Mark, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I guess first of all that we need to understand that the innovation system we have works, that it, with all its flaws and disappointments of getting the vaccines to everybody in the world, we have them because of that system, and we should support that system and not flirt with the waiver for political purposes as the US has done. But second, we need to build a robust global infrastructure of cooperation, of creating networks of global purchasing networks for developing countries, and we need to start to focus on that hard work of building better public health infrastructure, country by country, either helping the countries that are in the least positions to do it, or focusing on best practices for countries that are middle income or developed countries to ensure that we have better distribution of healthcare.
All right, Christina, the last word to you. If you had Narendra Modi sitting in front of you, what would you say?
I think that we need to focus on the long game. And I think this goes back to Mark's comments about investing in the future and owing it to our children and our children's children. There are things that we can do. It is possible for us to be prepared the next time around. We can make those investments now so that the future going forward, heaven forbid there's another pandemic, but that it is easier to deal with. And I think part of that is, as Mark said, is investing in the infrastructure in these countries. We can also invest in technology take-up. We can invest in training personnel. We can invest in manufacturing facilities. But I think taking the long perspective and looking to the future and not thinking so much about the now will serve us well going forward.
Great, thank you. And on that note, I want to thank you both, Professor Mark Schultz and Professor Christina Acri, for joining us for our last panel today and talking about the need to build this resilience. I think something that all of us hope is done and wish had been done for this pandemic, but lessons will be learned and hopefully taken forward in terms of how we tackle future situations like this one. In the meantime, also on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, want to thank all of you for watching today, and thank you for listening. We hope this information has been helpful to you in whatever work or research you're doing, or maybe just to make you feel a bit better about the way things will be handled in this pandemic and in the future. I'm Tasha Kheiriddin signing off. Have a wonderful afternoon.